Stand in the fields of Suffolk today, and you can still see the burial mounds rising from the ploughed earth. More than 17 million people in Britain carry Anglo-Saxon DNA in their veins, a genetic echo of farmers and warriors who crossed the North Sea 15 centuries ago. But rewind 1400 years, and you would have found a patchwork of kingdoms where Latin had died, cities lay abandoned, and the future of England hung in the balance between pagan gods and a new Christian faith. Timber, thatch, iron, silence. Using cutting-edge AI reconstruction, we are about to walk you through every aspect of Anglo-Saxon life, from the arrival of the first Germanic settlers to the world that William of Normandy would conquer in 1066. The Anglo-Saxon day began before dawn, when darkness still pressed against the wattle and daub walls of the hall. There were no glass windows. Light came through wooden shutters or horn panels scraped thin enough to glow amber when the sun rose. The fire in the central hearth had burned all night, tended by a servant or slave who slept nearest the embers. Smoke drifted upward through a hole in the thatched roof, blackening the oak beams overhead. The hall itself was the heart of Anglo-Saxon domestic life. A fence hall might stretch 40 feet long, its timber posts carved with interlace patterns or painted in ochre and red. Inside, benches lined the walls. At night, people slept on straw mattresses laid along these benches, wrapped in woolen cloaks. Privacy did not exist as we understand it. The lord and his lady might have a separate bower, a smaller timber building connected to the hall, but most families lived, ate, and slept in communal spaces. Archaeological excavations at Yeavering in Northumbria reveal a complex of timber halls built in the early 7th century, including a great hall capable of holding hundreds. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes. Possessions were few. A farmer owned a cloak, a knife, a wooden cup, perhaps an iron cooking pot. Wealth was measured in land, livestock, and the number of armed men a lord could summon. An Anglo-Saxon breakfast, if eaten at all, was bread and ale. Bread was dense and dark, made from barley or rye, sometimes mixed with ground peas when grain ran short. Wheat was reserved for the wealthy. Ale was not a luxury but a necessity, safer than water drawn from rivers and springs. Women brewed it weekly in every household, flavoring it with herbs before hops became common. The brewing was itself a kind of alchemy, the froth rising in wooden vats, the smell of fermentation filling the hall. By midday, the rhythm of labor depended entirely on the season and your status. If you were a chel, a free farmer, you worked your own strip of land in the open fields. Ploughing began in spring behind a team of oxen, the wooden oar breaking the heavy clay soil of the Midlands. You sowed barley, oats, beans, and flax. Harvest came in late summer, entire villages working together to bring in the grain before the rains. If you were a gabur, a tenant farmer, you owed 2 days of labor each week to your lord's estate, ploughing his domain, mending his fences, carrying his grain to the mill. The Rectitudine Singularum Personarum, a 10th century document, lists these obligations in meticulous detail. If you were a slave, a thrall taken in war or born into bondage, you owned nothing, not even your children. You worked until your lord freed you or you died. Slavery was common. As much as 10% of the population recorded in Domesday Book were thralls. Work was survival. Failure meant hunger. Anglo-Saxon England had no cities in the Roman sense. When the legions withdrew in 410, Londinium, Eboracum, and Verulamium emptied. Stone buildings crumbled. The Forum at Wroxeter was dismantled for building material. For 2 centuries, the Anglo-Saxons avoided these ghost towns, building instead in timber and thatch on new sites. The typical settlement was a village of perhaps 30 to 50 people, a cluster of halls and outbuildings surrounded by open fields. Archaeology reveals the layout. At Weststow in Suffolk, reconstructed from post holes and charcoal stains, archaeologists found sunken floor buildings called Grubenhauser, small workshops dug a foot into the earth where women wove cloth on upright looms. The streets, if they existed, were dirt tracks churned to mud in winter. Pigs rooted freely. Chickens scattered at the approach of a rider. There was no sanitation. Waste went into pits behind the hall or onto the midden heap at the village edge. But by the 9th century, towns began to reappear. Alfred the Great established a network of fortified burhs, planned settlements with gridded streets and defensive ramparts. At Winchester, the old Roman street plan was reimposed. Houses lined the high street, their gable ends facing the road, workshops at the rear. Craftsmen specialized. A street of butchers. A row of leather workers. The smell of tanning hides hung over the river. Trade revived. Merchants from the Rhineland brought glass and wine. Scandinavian traders arrived with furs and amber. By the reign of Aethelstan in the 10th century, England had mints producing standardized silver pennies in more than 60 towns. A farmer could sell grain for coin and use that coin to buy iron tools at market. The old subsistence economy was breaking. England was becoming urban again, not in the Roman manner, but in its own northern way, timber and thatch instead of stone and tile, yet unmistakably civic. When the first Anglo-Saxons arrived from the coasts of Denmark and northern Germany, they brought gods whose names still mark our calendar. Ty, god of war, claimed Tuesday. Woden, the one-eyed wanderer, ruled Wednesday. Tuna, the thunderer, took Thursday. Frigg, goddess of love, held Friday. These were not distant deities. They demanded sacrifice. A warrior might offer a horse before battle. A farmer might bury grain to ensure the harvest. Sacred groves dotted the landscape, places where priests called wigglers read omens in the flight of birds. Then in 597, Augustine landed in Kent. Sent by Pope Gregory the Great, he converted King Ethelbert within a year. The new faith spread unevenly, advancing and retreating like a tide. Northumbria converted under King Edwin in 627, then relapsed when Edwin died in battle. Penda of Mercia remained pagan until his death in 655, waging war on Christian kings and burning their monasteries. But by 700, the old gods were fading. Churches rose on the sites of pagan shrines. At Yevering, archaeologists found a pagan temple deliberately buried beneath a Christian chapel. The church calendar replaced the agricultural festivals. Yuletide became Christmas. The spring festival of Easter became Easter. Harvest home aligned with Lammas, the loaf mass of August. Monks introduced literacy. In the scriptorium at Lindisfarne, scribes produced the Lindisfarne Gospels, each page ablaze of interlace and color. Monasteries became centers of learning. Bede at Jarrow wrote his ecclesiastical history of the English people, the first coherent narrative of England's past. Saints' days structured the year. The feast of St. Cuthbert in March. St. Swithin in July. Every village had a church by the 10th century, a timber or stone structure where the priest rang the bell at dawn and dusk, marking time for a population that owned no clocks. Marriage among the Anglo-Saxons was a contract, not a sacrament, at least until the church tightened its grip in the 10th century. A man paid a bride price to the woman's family, and in return she brought a dowry, usually land or livestock. The ceremony itself was brief. Witnesses gathered. Oaths were sworn. A ring might be exchanged, though this was not universal. What mattered was the public acknowledgement and the consummation. Women had legal rights that would vanish after the Norman Conquest. A widow could inherit land. A wife could own property separately from her husband. The laws of Ethelbert, written around 600, specify compensation if a man seduces another's wife, the payment going to the husband, but the woman retained some agency. Divorce existed. If a woman wished to leave with her children, the law allowed it, though she forfeited the bride price. Childhood was short. Children worked as soon as they could walk, gathering eggs, scaring birds from the fields, carding wool. Sons inherited land. Daughters were married off to forge alliances between families or settle disputes. Infant mortality was brutal. Perhaps one child in 3 died before the age of 5. Mothers died in childbirth with grim regularity. Yet love existed. We glimpse it in the riddles of the Exeter Book, playful verses exchanged between lovers. We see it in the grave goods. At Sutton Hoo, a woman was buried with her child, a bone comb placed beside the tiny skull. Family was everything. Your kin group, your maith, provided protection in a violent world. If you were murdered, your family sought wereguiled, the man price paid to avoid a blood feud. If you committed a crime, your family paid the fine. Identity was collective. Disease was understood through the lens of sin and sorcery. A fever might be God's punishment or a curse cast by an enemy. Treatment combined Christian prayer with older herbal knowledge. The Lacnunga, a 10th century medical text, prescribes charms to be sung over wounds, potions brewed from plants gathered under the full moon. For a headache, bind feverfew to the temples. For infection, apply a poultice of garlic and honey. Some remedies worked. Honey is antibacterial. Willow bark contains a compound similar to aspirin. Others were pure superstition. If an elf shot struck you, an invisible arrow causing sudden pain, the cure involved reciting a charm and drinking water in which a knife had been dipped. Life expectancy was perhaps 35 years, though those who survived childhood might reach 60. When death came, the body was prepared by the family. In pagan times, the dead were cremated or buried with grave goods, weapons for men, jewelry for women, tools, and food for the journey to the afterlife. At Sutton Hoo, a ship was dragged inland and filled with treasures, a helmet, a sword, gold coins from Byzantium, the body of a king, possibly Raedwald of East Anglia. Christian burial was simpler. The body was wrapped in a shroud and laid in the churchyard, head to the west so the deceased would face east on the day of resurrection. No grave goods. The soul's destination depended on faith, not wealth. Stand in the nave of a Saxon church today, at Earls Barton or Bradford-on-Avon, and you can still see the limestone pilaster strips climbing the tower walls, the narrow windows, the unmistakable geometry of a world that built in stone what it once built in timber. The kingdoms of the Heptarchy are gone, united under the House of Wessex, then swept away by Norman swords. But the DNA persists. The field boundaries remain. The village names endure, every a ton and hammer reminder. This was a culture that refused to vanish. England remembers.